Good morning and welcome to RETHINK live webinar, Sustainability in Real Estate. Today, we will have an exciting discussion on sustainability in real estate. Real estate is one of the key players in the development of infrastructure globally. As sustainability continues taking place, increased awareness connected to real estate makes a significant impact on decisions made for new buildings with focus on the environment. I would like to invite you to place questions in the Q&A section, and we will have as many as you can, and then we will have time at the end of the session to answer some of those questions. You can also familiarize yourself with the links and download items, and you can also use emojis to basically tell us how you feel, how you are comfortable with the session and what you think about the session. I am Hernan Hidalgo, Director of Business Development for Danfoss Industrial Refrigeration in North America, and I am joined by my colleague Adam Anderson. Adam, please introduce yourself.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Adam Anderson. I'm the End User Business Development Manager here with Danfoss in North America.
Thank you, Adam, for joining me today. I would like to start by telling you about Danfoss and the work we do to contribute in energy reduction and sustainability. Danfoss was founded in 1933 with its origins in refrigeration. Today, we are well positioned in three business segments: climate solutions, power, and power electronics and drives solutions. Having a strong presence in over 100 countries and 97 factories, we have set clear commitments and objectives, and we are en route to achieving carbon neutral status by 2030. In this journey, we set out to be a leading technology partner for our customers, helping the decarbonization efforts through energy efficiency, minimizing carbon emissions. The real estate industry is basically, as we said, a major contributor in the development of that infrastructure. And we have been looking at some of the surveys and respondents on how basically people will see the sustainability become a reality. So in the survey that we have had from CBRE, we see an increased focus on ESG that is basically voiced by 70% of the respondents globally. We can see also the reduction in energy consumption and emissions as also a very key area of concern. And that basically is also followed by the well-being of the occupier of the building. Whether it's commercial, industrial, it's equally important. But also there are some concerns behind, which is the lack of data, which is in many cases 50% of the respondents are basically voicing that concern very, very strongly. In real estate, one of the major requirements or one of the major drivers there for increased focus on ESG in terms of the respondents, whether they're the investors or the occupiers of the buildings, there are many. But one of them was the imposition of new ESG disclosure requirements. If you have a building and you have to do the disclosure requirement, whether it's the energy, whether it's the materials, or anything that has to do with the building, are obviously very important to both the occupier and the investors. And that has become the number one priority or the number one reason for having that increased focus on ESG. But there are some other equal importance, and some of them are very relevant in today's world, which is inflation and energy prices that basically have been playing a significant role in how basically people see from the investor side and the occupier side the importance for the sustainability. If we take just one step down from, let's say, talking about that sustainability efforts, so what is it the top priority that is becoming part of this sustainability efforts? And there are many variables there. So there are many that are very, very equally important to some extent. But when you look at the respondents, they all seem to agree, whether it's the investor or the occupier, seem to have align very well is on the reduction of greenhouse emissions. And that is key because we obviously hear that on an everyday basis. But maybe Adam, you can also tell me a little bit more about that, because reduction on greenhouse emissions may be a too broad a word. Is there something that we can actually maybe make it a little bit more clear how that reduction in greenhouse emissions can be?
Sure, yeah. So, direct emissions, when we think about those, we think about the energy we consume directly, and that's essentially what it is. But when we look at indirect, we may be thinking in terms of the energy we consume. Where does it come from? Is it coming from a coal fire plant, for instance, or a natural gas plant, for instance? Or maybe it's coming from the trucks outside of our facility that are waiting to dock, that are sitting on idle. Um, other items might be the materials that we're using in the construction of the building. Where do those come from? What did the supplier produce in terms of CO2 emissions when producing these products that go into the construction? So those are some of the top items I would highlight when thinking about direct and indirect emissions.
Thanks, Adam. And actually, it's interesting because you mentioned obviously what is direct. Obviously, probably we can measure it and much easily. The indirect emissions probably are a little more tricky, and that's part maybe of the lack of data that some of the respondents were talking about. And if you look at North America, USA, Canada, different states, different provinces, then they also may have different sources of how they are actually producing that energy for you to consume it, right? So you mentioned nuclear, you mentioned maybe carbon. Hopefully, we are moving away in the future from that. But all of these factors actually make it's not like an average that we have, on the country that can be applicable to every single case, but also could be relate or linked to a specific geographical location where the building or the facility is in place. So that basically, definitely it's a big concern. But also we can see some other concerns like pollution, air, and water, and the reduction, obviously, of waste, which is also something that it's it's is very relevant. And it's when you see the chart, you can see how, for instance, occupiers are actually putting a very high emphasis on those three, because obviously when you're going to be in the building most of the time, whether it's a high-rise building or it's a commercial building where people are going to expose 8 hours or more in the building, then obviously the concerns of improving people's health is also equally important. So we look at all those factors, but the main purpose, the main driver for these organizational ESG goals also may be a number of reasons for them. On the respondents, again, on these surveys that we've been looking into, it's basically the effect on the own ethics of and values that basically that particular real estate company is having. Obviously, there are some others, whether it's customers and shareholders, or whether it's compliance also with the regulations. But what is interesting is that is a very close relationship between what the investor and the occupier actually are thinking when it comes to obviously having that set of values that are driving that sustainability efforts in the long run. Um, then we did talk about obviously reducing emissions, obviously energy, and all of that basically gets translated into something that it maybe sometimes is more tangible to everybody, right? And some of it is energy consumption. So if you have a building that has or somewhat can consider some level of efficiency, then if the investor or the occupier are making the decision, then yes, if you have it, then you potentially have or consider paying a premium for it. If that is not absent, if that's absent, if the building may not have that, the investors, they seem to be maybe seeking a discount, right? To because the building is not there yet. But also when they move to the next bucket, when from the perspective of much advanced technologies, smart technologies that can be adapted or adjusted to the building operations, actually that's very, very attractive, whether it's an investor or the occupier. And why? Because obviously there is operational cost. So if you wanted to lease or have that place, then both the investors or the occupiers could actually pay a premium for it. And again, if you don't have it, then it becomes a little bit lower on your priority. That becomes, and if it's absent, that we may look or they look for a discount, or altogether maybe not doing that investment or not going for that occupation. And we have seen others that are going beyond just the smart technology. But what other sources? We talk about direct emissions and indirect emissions. But if you imagine have your indirect emissions now linked to on-site renewables, then that actually has a significant impact on the decisions that you're making when you're investing in the building to be, to be ready for the occupants or for the occupiers to say, well, now I have obviously not only a direct access to my uh, to assess how much energy I consume, but also how I'm consuming that energy through renewables. And maybe Adam, you have seen maybe in the industrial settings something like this, some buildings that are nowadays looking at more premium built, but not premium for just as the sake of the adding cost for the sake of adding cost, but also because they produce or they provide a very strong benefit to both the investors and the occupiers. Can you please tell me something about this and your
Yeah,
setting?
absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, I think we certainly are seeing some companies using renewables in the form of solar panels. I know that you know some regional location may play a role in that, but certainly we are seeing, like we had spoke about before, the rising energy costs, and I think that's overall that's affecting all regions in some form or fashion. You may see your ramp up happening, at a faster pace in some places than others, but it's going to affect all of us. And in regard to that, we see these companies looking for solutions to help offset some of that. So they're doing it in the form of, as I said, we've seen solar panels. We've also seen some battery installations at some locations. And if the area is right for it, possibly wind turbines as well. So there's a plethora of technology on the market, and in the phase that we're in the world right now, with innovations coming out seemingly almost daily. These newer technologies are providing these companies with a means to provide cleaner, renewable energy sources that essentially, are going to cut costs for them and emissions.
Yeah, thank you, Adam. Yeah, this is definitely very, very relevant um, in this context. Um, One of the concerns also that was brought up in those surveys is the lack of data. Man, this is definitely a challenge because we always make informed decisions, or when we make decisions, we need enough data to actually have a very informed assessment of how we are going to spend or have something done in our daily lives, whether it's personal, whether it's obviously on the business side. And as the respondents have highlight here, the poor availability of data, or maybe the quality of the data, it's definitely a very big concern that people will have, because we talk about energy, we talk about emissions, we talk about well-being, but how can you actually even quantify? So if you can actually have tools to actually get the quantification on the one hand, but also that you can implement that quantification to bring that data and being able to assess how we can do it. And even if we have the data, then other variables start taking place, like there is lack of expertise. So what do we do with the data? What does data mean for me to actually make an informed decision? So there's definitely some very valid concerns here, and having that access to the data and get that information is essential, basically, uh, to make future business decisions and investment decisions in the future, whether you're on the investor side or you are the occupier side, right? Because we're talking about, okay, well, we have solar panels, but okay, we intuitively we can think that that will help us, but because we may not have that quantification in place, that makes it a little bit more challenging, basically, to move forward with the decisions. Um, in terms of sustainability and on how, again, we need to make those decisions and how basically we get data, there is something that has come to place and is the carbon disclosure. So the carbon disclosure is probably one of the first steps that you need to take to be able to, in fact, looking at where you are today to see where you can move in the future. And we can see that there is, an important uh, figures that we can see, the growth of that carbon disclosure to be part of that sustainability process. In North America, according to CDP that we have on the screen, so then we have, 5,156 uh, companies that are basically reporting, and that's 102% increase from what we have seen in previous years. In Europe, we can see a very, very strong growth from that perspective. And why? Obviously, the European Union has a very strong measures and is very strong regulations that people have to take place. So data is very important to take that first step. If there are some regulations in place that you actually have to adhere to and to make commitments to. So then you need to not only know where you start, but also how your actions will start getting that reduction, whether it's in emissions, whether it's in energy, to comply with the regulations in place. And in Asia, I mean, obviously it's a large population. There are a large number of companies, but we still see also an important growth. And it's important to see that uh, even though that the numbers may be small compared to the whole in the world, people are taking those steps actually to move forward to that carbon disclosure and getting the data that is needed. If we look at the European Union, which is basically this is not the case for North America. Obviously, Europe is basically, let's say, ahead in terms of the decisions that they have taken from the regulatory standpoint. So they have a very strong classifications. This is the taxonomy that they were talking about. How that double materiality assessment has to be taking place. So then we can look at those two dimensions from the circularity, water consumptions, pollution, biodiversity on the one hand, but also how those measures or those actions basically take place and have a financial impact, both for the company, but also for the financial and the markets, that basically the is whether it's cost or whether it's or actual benefits that can be measured from the financial perspective. So those are very interesting to see, and is also equally important and interesting to see how basically those flows will move forward in the future. At some point, maybe we will have or we will adopt similar measures, and then we will have an opportunity to also not just to learn from them, but just to look at what we do in North America and see how actually we can move forward and achieve those objectives as well. Um, In the EU, obviously, they talk lots about the double materiality, which is again is that the regulatory landscape that evolves and is accessing that concept that is rapidly becoming relevant in Europe. It really prioritizes the sustainability in those two dimensions. So it's the impact in materiality, which is the sustainability that matters, on people, again, on environment, and that basically it's the impact goes downstream, from the company towards everything that they do once the products or services are consumed, but also upstream. Where are those components? Where are those products actually made out of? Or where are those services basically used to actually get to that point? So that's very important from the impact in material standpoint, but also on the financial side, right? Because there may be some risks and opportunities, and that impact obviously cash flow or the cost of capital. So in the end, basically, those are very key, important measures, and they're, if you like, very relevant and visible to our daily operations. Another area that it's very common in Europe now, it's the new energy performance of buildings directive. They call it the EPBD. So they're very uh, set of directions in terms of net zero for new buildings. Obviously, if you have to make the investment, you may not have the same objectives and strategies that we had maybe in the early 2000s. Obviously, world has changed. We are looking at sustainability, and that has become a key area for new buildings. Renovation, obviously, because there are so many buildings out there that they still may need some, not only just a makeup, but also how basically they become more sustainable. That goes to hydronic balancing, HVAC, and also there is something that is interesting, and is the MEPS, which is the minimum energy performance standards that they are basically setting for the buildings. Again, that in the HVAC industry, even here, we had some of this SEER, requirements. So now it's kind of translating that into buildings and how basically those buildings can be actually rated. So when we have information, then we can actually have the data that allow us basically to take those decisions. And that is also important because, for instance, in Europe, during this classification process, they have, commercial property owners, in which, they rated, they were like 85% of the buildings were maybe built before the 2000s, before the new millennium, and 75% had very poor performance. So that also, it's something that will come to in Europe, how people will have to do these renovation building plans to make sure that basically you are much in line or much aligned with those requirements. And also the phase out of fossil fuel boilers, that basically happens, for us in North America. I have in particular a furnace that to warm up the house in the winter. So how we are actually changing that to maybe heat pumps, or basically also in the industrial side. And maybe, Adam, in the industrial side, there is also the same kind of principles and the same kind of challenges also occur. Maybe you can comment something on your side.
Yeah, I would say many of the facilities that we see, they're needing hot water or steam today. That's, being delivered by these fossil fuel boilers. And with programs such as cap and trade and different incentives that are out there, we're now seeing some of these companies turn towards solutions to reduce, even if they're not eliminating today these boilers, they're looking for solutions to reduce their consumption of natural gas. And then in other cases, we're seeing, innovation come out with these um, industrial heat pumps. These heat pumps are capable of basically replacing these boilers in some cases, and because electricity, it's much more efficient. from that supply standpoint than natural gas. You know, your emissions are reduced as a result when you're having electricity produced and you're supplying an industrial heat pump with that. As a result, you know, we're going to see things like COP increase on these heat pumps versus these boilers that we see. And yeah, in regards to some of these directives that are coming from Europe, I think although they're not directives that we're necessarily following in other places of the globe, that's going to help drive innovation in the space for things like best practices of renovating these buildings, or you know, best practices of how to update these refrigeration systems that are out there today. So that's where I see it.
Thanks, Adam. And actually, you touched a word that probably is more used in the industrial world, the COP, that maybe will become part of this MEPS, right? Because you know, when you look at that COP that you mentioned, it's just basically the way you rate that efficiency, right? And you're looking at, you know, what's the difference, for instance, between a fossil fuel boiler COP versus one electrified heat pump? What are we talking about, the ratio between those two?
Yeah, there's a tremendous difference. I mean, it's going to range, you know, based on the efficiency of the boiler that's installed. Obviously, newer boilers, newer technology are going to have a much cleaner burn and a much higher efficiency, but you know, the older ones are going to have a much lower. But nonetheless, you know, the COP of these ammonia heat pumps, you're looking in the range of, you know, I would say. 4, 5, 6, 7 in some cases. So I mean, it's interesting, and I know that, like, some of it on the CO2 side, it can, you start looking at it and you say, wow, this is astronomical improvements over what we're seeing with traditional gas fire boilers. Why aren't people running to make the switch? So it's something that certainly bears attention of the industry.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. We can see that. Um, we were talking about data, and that availability of data is obviously crucial for success, because we only can take decisions based on, you know, the information that we have at hand. And basically, obviously, when we look at the case of in Europe in particular, the climate and energy policy and regulations are really strong. They're top down in many cases for all, you know, regions in Europe. And also the disclosure that is happening, right? So it's getting, you know, like from F-gas regulations, eco designs, you know, very top priority from the government side. Maybe somewhat on the somewhat, you know, on the disclosure side, but also when you look at then the emission savings from many from energy savings, from eco design, from etc., from how basically again you do that that ladder of going upstream and downstream. What's the impact that you're putting yourself downstream of your products, but also the impact that you're putting upstream of what you're buying to produce the products and services that you have. So basically, all in all, basically that will contribute in that reduction of emissions overall. And there is no just one clear answer for it, but there is going to be a number of things that, you know, the moment that they're all put together, then basically they will all contribute to that improvement. And that will basically be achieved by having a better disclosure of information in terms of emissions, etc. And of course, you know, the very informed policies that allow people to make those changes. If we look at this in conclusion, obviously there is so many things that are interesting, they're important, that we can do. But again, if we don't have that data, then it's going to be a little bit difficult to actually take actions. And there are some things that we can do, and that we can learn from different industries, and maybe that sharing of maybe knowledge and sharing of, you know, expertise from different perspectives, from different stakeholders coming into the real estate, will help us actually make more informed decisions to basically achieve the goals. Obviously, there is part of it that is going to be more energy driven on the regulations, but also how all this will be connected from the finance perspective, from all again from disclosures agreement, that all of that information um, being put together, being organized and assessed accordingly, then will allow us to actually make those business decisions, and give us, let's say, the cost benefit much more clear, without that cloudy vision of just, okay, we want to do it for the sake of contributing to the sustainability, but is rather more physical, more visible, more tangible, in the contributions to our sustainability goals.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I would agree with that. And I would say, that also helps these companies tailor the message to the market that they're serving.
Yes. And what I thought, looking at these macro areas, it would be interesting to see, or taking a closer look at the very growing segment in the industry that is called cold storage. Um, Looking at the real estate industry in the United States, there are like probably 300 million square feet of let's say of real estate commercial, but only maybe 2 to 3% is actually cold storage. Well, there's a lot of differences between what is required from having a dry goods warehouse to having a cold storage warehouse, from the energy that they use, or from the cost basically also that it's entailed basically to get a cold storage uh, built with the set of standards that we need. So if we look at that, then there is some various factors in this growth. One of them is the age of cold storages in the USA, and maybe Adam, you can point us a little bit in a good direction here, because that's gonna be, or has been, one of the key elements also in this growth. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure, yeah. So, you know, infrastructure has kind of been built up over time, and as a result of that, I would say, about 70% of the cold storages are 40 years or older. If we think about it in terms of advancements in building technology, refrigeration technology, and the associated things, kind of like data and everything else we were talking about, you know, stuff has advanced. So things such as building envelopes, they're not as tight when they were built 40 years ago as they are today. The way that construction is done is completely different. We quite often we see these large panels being put up that are brought up with some sort of vacuum apparatus on the end of a crane, and then they just tip the panel up on the construction of the rack, if you will, and the rack kind of serves as the skeleton of the building. To the control side of it, PLCs and electronics, that has really came on, I would say, over the past 20 to 30 years. So the things that these refrigeration systems are able to do today are far, far different and much more advanced than they were, say, 30 years ago. And then the data that you're collecting from these systems is vastly different, right? So you're able to get much more data on these newer facilities with just the standard, type of installs that we see today versus the installs we would have seen years ago.
Yeah, that's right on. We also have seen a very explosive growth in e-commerce, in grocery sales. Some of the figures out there is that the expected growth, is like 3 to 1 between the, online grocery versus the in-store shopping and grocery shopping. And of course, there are so many factors from it. We came, the growth has been impacted from, big surges that we have through the pandemic. We all experienced that, and we all probably were, getting more familiar with how to to get grocery shopping online. And but that didn't, ended there. Then basically it brought in some benefits to it, and it continued that trend, maybe not to the same extent in terms of the search, but then basically it allow basically that technology to continue a growing path of convenience. Also, obviously, there is persistent inflation, high prices that have led consumers to maybe looking for a different pool of retailers. I don't know you, Adam, but I particularly, before I used to shop maybe one or two. Now maybe I shop in three or four, depending on what I need. Right. So that opens the door basically to having more retailers, higher demand, more retailers that may not use we're not using, let's say, the regular channels in terms of cold storage or distribution centers, but they were looking for other ones that needed to be built, and that also have fueled that growth, because many of the cold storages maybe that they were built, like you mentioned, a very long time ago, maybe we're not that close to the cities. Now we need speed. If you do e-commerce, speed is one of the key things, and then basically that demands the increasing demand capacity on the one hand, but also maybe closer to the cities, right? And maybe that also changes the landscape on how basically those buildings are designed. And maybe you can comment on that, because you have seen, for instance, on that increase in terms of cold storage construction now being from the standard sizes to other sizes. Maybe you can comment on that, Adam.
Sure, absolutely. So I think naturally, we understand that we have large population centers, and that's in all countries around the world. And for these companies to, operate in a manner that maximizes their profit and maximizes their ability to serve the largest part of the population, they need to be close to these population centers. As a result, of the growing population globally, these population centers, the amount of land available is becoming less and less, and that's increasing prices. So as a result, whereas, 30, 40 years ago, a company may have been able to go out and easily procure 30 or 40 acres, around one of these big cities. Now they may only be able to get, say, 2 to 5 acres or something like this. So now these cold storages, they have to try to serve the same amount of area or the same amount of volume, but over a smaller footprint. And as a result, we're seeing, the height of these buildings increase. And if we do, touch on the rapid increase in e-commerce, I mean, I for one can recall, 15, 20 years ago, I very seldom was buying anything online. Maybe a pair of shoes, maybe a book, something that was not perishable for sure. None of my groceries were coming. I think with the pandemic and what we saw there, and people were reluctant to go out, the population kind of rethought how they wanted to procure their goods and services with minimum interaction with the population. And in doing so, we've seen this explosion in the need for refrigerated and perishable goods to be able to be quickly delivered to customers in a hurry. And as you said, you have multiple places you go. You have to look. I for one, where I'm at in outside of Baltimore, I have to sometimes go to some of these multiple vendors because maybe the products that I'm looking for, one doesn't have in stock, but another one does. And having the ability to have someone bring that to my door eliminates the need for me having to physically go from store to store and search for that. So as a response to that, the industry certainly has needed to increase capacity across the board for cold storage and perishable goods, so that they can carry an adequate amount of stock to serve the population centers that that they're targeting.
Yeah. Thank you, Adam. So when we look at obviously some of this growth and some of the figures out there, there is definitely a very, very strong growth that is projected for the future, but also, how 3PLs have been making a significant investment in that sector and is contributing basically to close that gap of demand that maybe even maybe for the traditional consumers of cold storage space, but also for maybe smaller end users that require that fulfilling of that food distribution that you were talking about, as basically everything became a little bit more a wider variety of needs out there. Then, if we look at the cold storage per se, there is it's amazing that the 30% of the global electricity consumption comes from the food and beverage industry. And that basically is combining the cold storage and food processing. And if we move just to look at the energy consumption, on the food processing is about 35%, but on cold storage, I mean, that's intensive, but in cold storage is really intensive at 54%, and that's average, right? So definitely that is something that is that requires a very acute look on how basically the investments that we need to make to have the operation of the facility, in a much relevant and cost effective way to provide the services to the end users. And I guess these are figures that obviously you deal with on an everyday basis, right, Adam?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think too, when we look at the two categories here of food processing and cold storage, um, they're both trying to make things cold or cool things off, but at the end of the day, the load profiles are quite a bit different. Where the cold storage, it can be a bit more stable because they're basically just housing cold goods and basically serving to move those, in and out of their facility. Whereas food processing, those guys, they're, doing things such as producing food, bringing things to market, and food, it needs to be cooled rapidly. So the load profiles are a bit different. But back to cold storage, I would say, there, because of the stability that the load profile has, we've come up with some unique solutions here to maybe help deal with some of the challenges that the industry faces. So I know we have a very strong value proposition in some of the products that we've provided in terms of taking deeper dives and really looking at where the energy is spent and then how we can work to recapture and provide savings to some of that. So things such as our new evaporator, complete control solutions that we've come out with that are enabling customers to save, 10 to 20% on just the control of the evaporator in DX applications. And then on the flip side, if they are running something like recirculated pump liquid overfeed or some sort of flooded system, there on the pump side, we're able to really help reduce the recirc rates there. And in doing so, we're not putting as much ammonia out. So that could help maybe expand the area of the cold storage in the future if that's needed without the need for necessarily adding on more vessels, more engine room capacity, more compressors, things of that nature. And then on the flip side, if they're not looking to expand, well, then maybe you can take some of that charge off site, and then that may help with things such as insurance costs and savings in those areas. So we've definitely looked at that side of it, and then on other arenas, I would say, such as defrost and defrost methods. We know that traditionally a lot of these evaporators, if they're running below 32 degrees, they're going to build frost. They're going to need to be defrosted. And the traditional method for doing so is a pressure regulation method. We know that pressure regulators just bypass whatever's coming through as long as the pressure's satisfied. So, be it gas or liquid, um, they're going to let it through. And that gas on traditional defrost types is going to work to load that system up. So, implementing things such as our float drainer technology and our ICF platform, that's going to reduce, install costs on the front end because now you're only dealing with two welds versus multiple welds, and having that very compact type frame that it sits in, is going to allow it to be applied into more areas that are existing without the need for necessarily having to do a lot of repiping and things like that. And then ensuring that during every defrost that you make from there moving forward with that technology, now you're only bringing liquid and not so much gas back. And that's really working to significantly reduce, load on your engine room and thereby reduce energy consumption. So
Yeah,
those
absolutely.
are two types of the technology that I can think of, in recent memory we've come
The
with.
good news is that then we can quantify on the energy reduction, but also quantify on the carbon footprint optimization, right? And this is basically one of the key things, for real estate, the investing in cold storage, that basically there are clear technologies that allow you to boost operational efficiency, cut the carbon footprint, but also have that information. And then there is technologies out there, including Danfoss technologies, that allow you to put things into the cloud for that integration. Many of the most modern facilities, they are also very fully automated. So labor is basically energy is just a second to labor in many cases. So, once you do the full automation, now energy will become, your major energy consumption. And that's something that is going to be key to be taken into account. So I really appreciate all your time today. Let us see if there's some um, questions in the chat. Let's take a look at the chat. I can see one question. You have been talking about okay, energy efficiency. Can you provide some figures as to what numbers or figures you can achieve? Maybe Adam, you can answer to that one.
Sure,
I
yeah.
guess
So
it's
I
it varies a lot because we're talking about a lot of the real estate that can be buildings from one to another. But maybe if we narrow it down to maybe in your area at least, maybe that's something that we can provide an answer to this question.
Yeah, so I would say, with the with our NeoCharge technology that we've brought to the market there, on typical DX evaporator applications, again, it can vary, but we're seeing savings on the order of 10 to 20% there. And then, with the float technology we were talking about, again, it's going to be dependent upon evaporator capacity and things of that nature. But overall, we have a white paper, I would say, that we've published, and that provides a pretty good baseline. So I think, I think we looked at maybe an 11-ton evaporator, and I think there the savings were around $1 per defrost. So if you have 30, 40, 50 evaporators in your facility, quite often in the US, we know that evaporators are much larger than 11 tons. um, you know, and you're running two to three defrosts a day in some cases, these savings can really add up when you start looking at the figures. And those are two of the more prevalent technologies. But there's also other things. I know we had talked about, gas boilers, and things of that nature. A lot of times we look at processing plants and we'll see that they have an ammonia refrigeration system that's running, essentially 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. It's producing heat off of the compressors. That
Mm-hmm.
heat is being put through condensers, but no efforts being made to recover that heat. And now with the increased energy prices, people are now looking and taking a look at that, and also the carbon reduction side of it. It's quite astounding how much carbon emissions you can cut. And if you have if you have a company that's participating in cap and trade, those carbon credits you could get, you could use those to kind of trade off to some of these other companies who really can't avoid the carbon emissions that they're creating in areas such as data centers, in other places like that.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. We see one more question, and I think that's going to be the last question for our session here. Actually, you touch a little bit about that, but it's on the carbon footprint reduction. So, yeah, maybe just to that point, you mentioned about energy reductions, and again going back a little bit on the direct and indirect emissions. If you can quantify, like you said, the energy reduction, for instance, in the cold storage, actually, that kind of level of 10-15% that you were talking about, there are very strong calculations data that can allow you to get to the number for a cold storage that is, let's say, average 300,000 square feet in the United States or in Canada. Then basically cutting energy by 10, 15, let's say 12.5%, just to say, to have that something in the middle, is actually the equivalent or about 500 metric tons of CO2. And that is substantial, because obviously without the data, again, we don't know how to quantify. But there is already a number of tools available to actually assess, the energy reductions, but also the carbon footprint. And that's something that maybe as part of, or how we are moving forward, so the different potentially stakeholders like Danfoss or many other companies that are also in the industry can start sharing that type of information, so then we can all help each other make more informed decisions in the future. So with this, basically, I would like to close. So I would like to thank you, Adam, for your participation, and I would like to thank you all for coming in here today and spending time on this very interesting topic, which it's always having an impact, and we are connected to in one way or the other, whether it's in the commercial, whether it's in the personal or the industrial side of the industries. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you all. If you have any questions or you want to talk more about energy saving, CO2 reduction in particular at a facility that you may have, please feel free to reach out to us. We have a lot of trained professionals in the industry, and we're always free to talk.